I'd just like to welcome you to this event hosted by Field and Clegg Bradley and the Field and Foundation. I'm just going to share my screen. So I hope everybody can hear, and I'd just like to welcome you to the event this evening. My name is Peter Clegg of Field and Clegg Bradley Studios and the Field and Foundation. And I thought I'd just give you a brief introduction as to why we're here and what we have planned for this evening. About 15 years ago, my partner Richard Fielden died in a tragic accident. We decided to set up a foundation in his name to focus on architecture for education in East Africa. Richard's mother taught in Kenya, and his wife Tish, who's one of our trustees, was born in Uganda, whilst both their parents were working in the health service. So there is a strong link between the Field and Foundation and East Africa. Over the last 15 years, we've undertaken a number of projects working with schools and educational institutions, helping them to develop their vision and aspirations and their building to meet their needs. It's very stimulating work for our architectural practice, particularly for the young graduates who generally get involved and give their time for free. It's very much a two-way learning process for us. As an architectural practice working globally, we're very much aware of the current climate and biodiversity crises. Indeed, we helped set up Architects Declare, which provided us with a focus around which practices could commit to seriously reducing the 40% of global carbon emissions for which we're responsible through our association with the construction industry. And we now have 1,000 plus practices in the UK, 6,000 globally, and in 27 countries worldwide. And the last country to join us only a couple of weeks ago was Kenya. Now, in any discussion of global emissions from UK perspective, has to start from acknowledgement that the UK has been largely responsible for the situation we're in. Everybody has their own favorite ways of expressing this as a problem. This is a graphic I saw recently, which shows that actually, if you're my age, if you're 70, 85% of the total carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since 1750, since the Industrial Revolution began, has happened in my lifetime. Everything is running completely out of control. This is another way of looking at it. The orange graph there is the emissions that largely the UK has put into the atmosphere in the last 250 years. This is the rest of Europe. The blue area here is the United States, and here's Asia and China coming in from the top corner. But the small sections of color here are the global south. The extraordinary inequality of emissions is something we cannot forget when we're discussing these things. And here's another way of looking at it with the United States way up here in terms of its total carbon emissions per capita in the United Kingdom. And way down on the right-hand side, we have the countries of East Africa with about 1/100th of those carbon emissions per capita. And finally, and I think this really summarizes a lot of the issues that we want to talk about today, this is looking at the percentage of population growth by the year 2080 as compared to climate change vulnerability. And so you see the vertical axis here shows all of the countries in Africa in red here with dramatically increased population. And working from on the horizontal axis, we're moving from less vulnerable to more vulnerable people, showing that most of Africa is the most vulnerable to climate change, to the effects of climate change, to deforestation, to drought. And it's in those areas that we most need the social provision and the necessary urbanization to deal with population increase. And that's why there is the gross inequalities between global south and global north are really going to come to the fore in the next 3 decades. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with a discussion about how we are going to meet those. I'll just stop sharing my screen. How we're going to meet the needs of those populations in areas where there is already a shortage of architects and planners and engineers. And we have Peter Oborn here, and Peter I've met several times in different parts of the world in his role as an international representative of the RIBA and as an ambassador for the Commonwealth Society of Architects. We have Dr. Mark Olnwini, who I've met also in the UK, but is also a professor in Uganda. And they're going to talk about the issues of education of the new generation of professionals in East Africa in particular. In the second session, we're going to focus on bioclimatic design and how carbon itself is a real issue in terms of both construction of buildings and operation of buildings. We've got Isabel Sanderman, has produced with me the climate change, the climate design manifesto that we're talking about. And we have Fatou Guié, who is from Rwanda, who is going to talk about extraordinary work that she's been doing in the development of low carbon bricks. So there are going to be 2 sections of the presentations today. We'll start with Peter and Mark, and we'll then have a short discussion. And then we'll go on to Isabel and Fatou and have another discussion around the solutions to low carbon design, if you like. So I'm going to hand over to Peter. Now, Peter is a practicing architect for over 30 years. He spent the past decade promoting sustainable development at a city scale, working with national governments, local government, and he's also a fellow of the built environment professionals around the world. He served as vice president for international affairs at the RIBA, and he continues to work with them as a strategic advisor, alongside his current role as president-elect of the Commonwealth Association of Architects. So welcome, Peter.
Peter, thank you. I'm gonna build on your, I'm gonna segue from your presentation. I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna segue from your presentation, but I'm gonna tell much the same story, but in a little bit more detail. Assuming that you can see that now. Yeah, so thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this evening's event. And I'd like to situate my contribution kind of squarely in the context of the Decade of Action, which is upon us, of course. And I'd like to zoom right out and offer a Commonwealth perspective on the nature and the scale of the challenge that you were describing. Why is this such an important issue for us in the Commonwealth? Well, because nearly 50% of the projected 2.5 billion additional urban dwellers by 2050 are going to be in the Commonwealth. And that's 1 billion more urban dwellers in the next 30 years, with, as you said, the vast majority of that growth, 95% of that growth, taking place in Asia and Africa. And much of that growth, indeed most of that growth, is going to be taking place in secondary cities. Roughly 50% of the Commonwealth lives in its 184 largest cities, but the remainder live in over 5,000 cities of less than 500,000 population. And the significance of this is, of course, that these cities are expanding at the same rate as the larger cities. They account for an equivalent amount of carbon emissions, and they're largely unthought about in the grand scheme of things, but they're a bit like an iceberg, you know, with much of the kind of challenge that we're speaking about here out of sight. And then, of course, when we look at the scale of the challenge that you were referring to, Peter, you know, the scale of the growth that is being projected over the next 60 years in this particular slide, you know, is quite extraordinary. And if we look at Africa alone, the projections are, because of the population growth and migration that you've been referring to, that Africa alone is projected to add nearly 90 billion square meters of additional accommodation in the next 40 years. And if you add up all the blue bars on the right of this diagram and compare them with all the orange bars on the left, you'll see that we're projecting to build more in the next 60 years than we have ever built to date. If we look at the population figures that you were talking about earlier, Uganda's population, Mark will know this better than me, but Uganda's population is forecast to quadruple by 2050. Malawi, Tanzania, Mozambique, Kenya, Zambia to increase by a factor of 3. You know, these are staggering figures. And as you said, here's my version of your chart with the chart from various Maplecroft showing that 95% of the cities most affected by climate change and considered at extreme risk, you know, are in Asia and Africa. So we have this combination, this overlapping, overlayering combination of characteristics, which is increasing vulnerability. And as you rightly say, you know, if we look here at rates of CO2 per capita versus rates of urbanization, this is just as much a challenge for us in the global north, well, more of a challenge for us in the global north in the short term than it is for those in the global south. But if we look at the numbers, and I could spend 10 minutes talking about this slide because I think it's so important. It keeps me awake at night, this slide. When we look at the top 20 carbon producing countries in the Commonwealth, there's only 250 million people in those top 20 countries producing 2.3 billion tons of CO2 per annum. There's 10 times as many people in the remainder of the Commonwealth producing an equivalent amount of CO2. But if we project this forwards, look at the rates of urbanization in those countries, look at the rate at which they're urbanizing and the rate at which they're growing. If we can't work together to work in a more sustainable way, we are literally all sunk. So this is the kind of challenge which the 4 Commonwealth associations of planners, architects, surveyors, and engineers kind of stood back to take a look at a year ago. And we published the results of a survey last June of the built environment professions in the Commonwealth, looking at, you know, the capacity of our profession, our colleagues overseas, to cope with the challenges ahead. And this graph here shows the ratio of architects per 1,000 head of population. In some ways, it's a somewhat dry chart, but what it shows is that in the OECD countries in the global north, the average ratio of architects per 1,000 head of population is about 0.45. But if we go back to countries like Mark's Uganda, you'll find the ratio is 0.005. And when we convert that into real numbers, that's 40-odd thousand architects here in the UK with a population of 60 million, urbanizing at 1% per annum or less, compared with Uganda, where there's, at the last count, 221 architects in a population of 45 million, urbanizing at over 6% per annum. And no formally recognized planning profession. You know, I mean, it's quite a thought. We then look at the rates of urbanization and we overlay the 2 charts on top of one another, and we can see quite clearly that there is a critical lack of capacity amongst built environment professionals in many of the Commonwealth countries, which are urbanizing most rapidly and are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And I'm showing here only the chart for architects, but it's a similar pattern for architects, for planners, for engineers, and for surveyors. And then, of course, when we look at the scale of education provision, because, you know, we can grow the profession, of course, but we can't grow it fast enough because the ratio of learning places per head of population is similarly, unfortunately, skewed. And so there simply isn't enough capacity to grow the profession, even if that was the answer, which, of course, I don't believe it is. Similarly, if we look at competency, you know, a question arises also whether we as professionals, and the question applies equally for us in the global north, of course, as it does for those in the global south, whether we as professionals have the skills necessary to deal with the changing world. And what our survey revealed was that around 40% of respondents don't undertake mandatory continuing professional development. You know, so it does raise this issue about competency, and we all know we have challenges in our own country here in the UK around climate literacy. And then the final kind of key finding of our survey was turning to the matter of built environment policy, where 30% of our respondents told us that their planning policy wasn't fit for purpose, and 60% said even if it was, it wasn't being implemented effectively. Similarly, in the case of building code, 45% told us that their building code wasn't fit for purpose, 70% said it wasn't being implemented effectively. But again, looking forwards and remembering that slide I showed earlier about the scale of the growth expected in Africa and the level of CO2 emissions, all of this needs to be seen in the context of this illustration, which shows from the International Energy Agency that 70% of Commonwealth countries don't have a mandatory energy code anyway. So it's not a question of compliance, there's nothing to comply with. So we need to think about these issues layered upon one another and the consequences if they're not addressed. So these were the three key findings of our survey: critical lack of capacity, critical lack of educational and institutional capacity, and this weakness in built environment policy. And just to kind of corroborate our evidence with the findings of others, these are the results from the UN Sustainable Solutions Development Network. And if we look at their assessment of progress towards the achievement of SDG 11, between the periods 2017 to 2019, you can see here that progress was unchanged in 23 countries, improving in only 2 countries, but actually worsening in 10 countries. Now, there are more recent results than that. I haven't updated this slide. They are getting slightly better, but not notably better, and certainly not sufficiently better. So this is the reason why we, as the Commonwealth Association of Architects, have come together with the Association of Commonwealth Universities, the Commonwealth Association of Planners, the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, and with support from the government of Rwanda, to promote a call to action on sustainable urbanization in the Commonwealth. And the program itself, the call to action is the product of quite an extensive dialogue that's been taking place over the past 18 months. And we've now published this call to action to heads of government who will be meeting in Kigali in June this year. And our call to action calls for increased focus on sustainable urbanization, increased interdisciplinary cross-sector working in order to engage with the challenges we face. Because if we do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always got, and we need to do something different, and we need to do it together. And at that, I think, Peter, I'll end my presentation and thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's yeah, a huge and slightly depressing presentation, but I'm sure that what we need to do is kind of look forwards and look at what's going to happen after that Commonwealth conference, and look at what we can do to actually affect the change. And Mark is going to give a different perspective on things, I suppose, from someone who teaches both in the UK and in Uganda. Mark is a program leader for the Bachelor of Architecture at Lincoln School of Architecture and Urban Design, and a research associate professor in architecture at the Faculty of the Built Environment at Uganda Martyrs University. So he divides his time between